All right, so we got new reporting coming out that members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus are officially trying to rein in President Biden's ability to conduct warfare overseas without congressional approval, this time specifically relating to the ongoing Saudi blockade and offensive campaign against Yemen. So there's kind of two different aspects to this story. Number one, we have new data and reports that are coming out about the complicity of the United States directly in civilian casualties in this conflict. And then the other aspect that we're going to get to is this recent push by the CPC in order to address this issue. So to start us off here from Common Dreams, Brett Wilkins, he says, new demands for Yemen war powers resolution as reports reveal the depth of U.S. complicity in airstrikes. So a little bit of details here. They say a leading peace group on Monday said a new report detailing the depth of U.S. support for Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen, hundreds of which have been called war crimes by international legal experts, shows the need for Congress to pass a recently introduced measure to end American complicity in one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And they say, according to the Washington Post, which along with the Security Force Monitor, SFM, at Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, analyzed thousands of news reports and images to identify warplanes from Saudi Arabia and the UAE that have attacked Yemen, and they say, quote, a substantial portion of the air raids were carried out by jets developed, maintained, and sold by U.S. companies and pilots who were trained by the U.S. military. And of course, I pointed this out a million different times, but if you go and look at who Joe Biden appointed to lead the Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, he literally just got off the board of Raytheon, one of the companies that is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, okay, and he got $1 million payout as he left the board of Raytheon. So again, you see the corrupting influences of the military-industrial complex, obviously going to be continuing with an imperialist like Joe Biden. But they continue saying this, despite a February 2021 pledge by Joe Biden to end U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-led war, a promise that has been repeatedly sidestepped via arms sales and a $500 million maintenance contract. So again, I covered this on my channel, the offensive operations narrative that President Biden was putting forward early in February of 2021, and you can go and check my first video that I did when he said that he was going to be ending offensive support. And it was pretty obvious from the beginning that this was completely disingenuous, because the entire Saudi-led campaign against Yemen is inherently offensive. They have the disproportionate amount of power. They are bearing down on this group, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, that have been in control of the country for years now, and they are continuing to just absolutely obliterate this country, both with their airstrikes that they've been conducting, killing thousands and thousands of civilians, but on top of that, almost more importantly, continuing this ongoing blockade that has resulted in potentially hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children either dying from starvation or now being on the verge of dying from starvation. So, when you say you're not supporting offensive operations while the people who you are supporting are continuing to do shit like that, seems like it's pretty much a direct contradiction at face value. But they give us a little bit more details here, saying last week, a bipartisan group of 48 House lawmakers introduced a war powers resolution directing the removal of U.S. armed forces from hostilities in the Republic of Yemen that have not been authorized by Congress. And this is how these types of armed conflicts are supposed to go, right? This is why the 1973 war powers resolution was put in place in the first place, was specifically to rein in the unilateral power of a president to send us to war. We should have some form of a democratic check by our elected representatives to decide if we want to involve ourselves in any of these seemingly endless conflicts. But again, you have the Biden administration still relying, as we do for pretty much any armed conflict overseas, still relying on that 2001 authorization for the use of military force that was initially specifically supposed to be designated for Afghanistan, but basically then just branched off into the entire war on terror and is now being used to justify any action in any part of the world, including Yemen. So that's why you would want to introduce a war powers resolution specifically relating to Yemen, so that he's not able to rely on some of those old authorization for the use of military forces. And honestly, on top of that, you should also be repealing the 2001 AUMF on top of introducing a specific piece of war powers resolution that they're doing here. But finally, to finish us off from this article, they say, writing for Just Security, Priyanka Modaparthi, director of the Counterterrorism, Armed Conflict, and Human Rights Project, that's a long-ass name there, at Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, and SFM's Tony Wilson noted Saturday that during 7 years of war so far, coalition airstrikes have killed nearly 9,000 civilians in Yemen. And again, that's just the airstrikes, okay? That's not even talking about the ongoing blockade, which has resulted in potentially hundreds of thousands of deaths. But they say, quote, human rights groups and the United Nations mandated group of eminent experts have documented more than 300 airstrikes that are likely war crimes or violations of the laws of war. They continued, these strikes have hit hospitals and other medical facilities, markets, a school bus filled with children, and a funeral hall filled with mourners. And they say independent human rights groups, journalists, and UN monitoring bodies have found U.S. weapons in many of these attacks. I've covered this numerous times on this channel, but again, no surprises there. Obviously, if the United States and other Western allies like Britain are providing, upwards of like 80 to 90% of the military, logistical, and intelligence support that Saudi Arabia is using for this offensive campaign against Yemen, obviously our weapons are going to be found in the, rubble in the aftermath of a lot of these airstrikes that are killing thousands and thousands of civilians. But they say the post-SFM investigation comes amid widespread U.S. and Western condemnation of alleged and documented war crimes, Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And I just wanted to add this little bit here, as well as this one down here, just to point out a little bit of a contradiction in terms of when the United States picks and chooses when it wants to care about human rights abuses. And obviously, if you're principled about this, as I believe that I am, it's easy to call out Russian war crimes, but it's a lot more difficult when you are the president of the United States and you're coming up against a so-called ally in Saudi Arabia, and you also have the added aspect that Biden is going to be traveling to Saudi Arabia to basically get on his hands and knees and beg them to lower oil prices on the global market. But it's easy to call out Russian war crimes. It's a lot more difficult to actually be principled in your stance on human rights abuses and war crimes and call out your supposed allies like Saudi Arabia or like Israel as well, in the aftermath of that assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist in Palestine. But of course, we're not going to get any condemnations here of Saudi Arabian war crimes in Yemen. But just another contradiction here, they say, the president's decision to visit the fundamentalist kingdom, one of the world's worst human rights violators in the world, stands in stark contrast to the U.S. exclusion of Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan leaders from the upcoming Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, purportedly due to the lack of democracy and respect for human rights in those countries. So again, it's not to say that none of these other countries have any problems within them that are worth criticizing, but it's to say that, listen, you look at these situations and how the United States empire just picks and chooses when it wants to call out war crimes, when it wants to point out a lack of democratic principles, when it wants to point out, human rights abuses or otherwise. I mean, it's so blatantly hypocritical and inconsistent that I think that anybody should be able to see through that. But now we're going to get into a little bit more details in terms of what the legislative push is actually centering around. So here from The Intercept's Sarah Sirota, she says Congress launches a new bipartisan effort to end the war in Yemen. And she says more than 7 years have passed since Yemen's Houthi rebels leveraged popular frustration over fuel prices to oust the government of then President I'm definitely going to butcher this name, but Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi. That was a troubling development for Saudi Arabia, which had allied with the overthrown leadership to secure access to a key oil shipping lane off the coast of Yemen. And they say the prospect that a movement purportedly backed by regional foe Iran would control this waterway was unconscionable to Saudi Arabia, so the oil kingdom convened an international coalition under the leadership of then Saudi Defense Minister Mohammed bin Salman, now the Crown Prince, that could suffocate the insurgents. And with the support of the United States, Saudi Arabia established a devastating port blockade that slashed the flow of commercial and humanitarian goods into Yemen and littered the country with bombs that have killed countless civilians. And they say during the Trump administration, some Democrats, joined by a handful of Republicans, fought to end the U.S. bomb sales, intelligence support, and warplane refueling that made the Saudi intervention possible. But with a Riyadh-friendly president in the White House, their efforts never really had a plausible chance of actually forcing the kingdom to withdraw. And they say Democrats at the time didn't bear responsibility for managing relations with a major weapons customer and oil producer that helped keep gas prices low at home. And in early 2019, when majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, for the first time in history, invoked the 1973 War Powers Resolution to end U.S. involvement, Saudi Arabia could rely on former President Donald Trump's veto. So again, that was the reality under Donald Trump, literally willing to veto this legislation that Congress was making, a bipartisan effort. Okay, if you've ever seen one that was actually positive here, a bipartisan effort that passed in order to end the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. And of course, Donald Trump steps in to use his power to prevent prevent that from happening. But they continue here saying, so the war dragged on, and President Joe Biden adjusted U.S. policy when he entered office by demanding an end to offensive support. Again, bullshit, but we understand that. But this didn't have material impact for Yemenis trapped by the blockade and Saudi air raids supporting it. And in November, the United Nations estimated that 377,000 Yemenis would be dead by the end of 2021, 70% of whom would be children. 70% of roughly 400,000 Yemenis. Okay, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of children susceptible of starving to death as a result of this blockade that Saudi Arabia is launching and that the U.S. is supporting. But they say, according to the World Food Program, more than 17 million Yemenis are battling food insecurity, and that figure is expected to rise to 19 million, or nearly 1/3 of the entire population by the end of this year. And 2 months ago, the UN brokered a ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis that gave the population some respite, but it's scheduled to end this week, and I think we've passed this mark so far. It's like June 7th now. I think that this was scheduled to end on June 2nd, but haven't really seen major updates on that. But it could be that they end up extending this ceasefire, and that would be absolutely fantastic. But on top of that, you have to understand that even if there is a ceasefire between the Houthi rebels and Saudi Arabia, that does not mean that Saudi Arabia is going to lift the blockade on their ports, which again is where the disproportionate amount of harm to civilians is actually coming from. But they say numerous aid groups are calling for an extension of the ceasefire, and they say with the deadline looming, Representative Peter DeFazio from Oregon, the co-founder of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, introduced a new resolution on May 31st invoking the 1973 War Powers Resolution to demand that Biden end U.S. military participation in the Yemen war. And according to a press release from the CPC, Senator Bernie Sanders will introduce a companion resolution when the Senate is back in session. And just a little bit of context in terms of who has been supporting this. They say CPC Chair Pramila Jayapal, you got Representative Ro Khanna, obviously that same dude from Oregon, DeFazio, but you also have even more like moderate, I guess, if you want to use that deranged phrasing, but really conservative-leaning Democrats. You even got dudes like Adam Schiff, you got Jim McGovern, you have some other Republicans as well, Nancy Mace, Thomas Massey, Ken Buck, Matt Gaetz even, Andy Biggs, etc. So listen, I mean, that's an absolutely fantastic push. Obviously, again, it's bipartisan. I'm wondering if this is actually going to end up passing. There was some success in the previous attempt at doing that, and now it's basically just going to be mostly up to Joe Biden at this point, because if they're able to successfully get this War Powers resolution through both the House and the Senate, that it's going to end up on Joe Biden's desk in pretty much the worst timing that you could possibly ask for from his perspective. Because right now, after running on the campaign trail and saying, oh, I'm going to create Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman into the pariah that they are, basically completely contradicting that, continuing to sell them weapons, continuing to be complicit in this war, and now he's been put in a position where, even though he's been semi-rhetorically critical for Saudi Arabia for example, killing Jamal Khashoggi and having him dismembered, a Washington Post journalist, even though he's been somewhat rhetorically confrontational to Saudi Arabia, he's now going to be meeting with them. He's getting on his hands and knees and is going to be begging them to release more oil into the global market in order to address some of the issues with gas pricing that we've seen here in the United States, which even in that debate, I think there's a fair debate to be had there in terms of how effective that would be versus how effective it would be to, say, nationalize our energy productive capabilities here in the United States domestically. We got for-profit billion-dollar energy corporations, fossil fuel corporations who are making billions of dollars in profits right now, record level profits for many of them, at the expense of average consumers, in this case specifically relating to gas prices. So, if you wanted to actually address the issue of gas prices right now, I would be going after the U.S. multinational fossil fuel corporations, number one. But if you're going to get on your hands and knees, you're also going to have to contend with the fact that you might be getting on your hands and knees and going and begging Mohammed bin Salman, while you're still calling him a human rights abuser, begging him for oil, while you're also going to be having to go back to the White House and finding a piece of legislation on your desk that is going to be calling to abruptly end U.S. involvement in this war. And also a reminder, because the U.S. and the United Kingdom and other Western allies are supplying Saudi Arabia with all of this material support, if that evaporated, this war ends. I mean, Saudi Arabia does not single-handedly have the capability to continue this war in the way that they have been doing without U.S. direct support in all the different ways that they were talking about there. So this is really a good opportunity to do something positive, to push us in the right direction of not supporting, rampantly theocratic, authoritarian leaders in the Middle East who are committing widespread war crimes and human rights abuses. It's a good opportunity for us to maybe, check one off of our box in terms of lessening the evil very slightly of the U.S. empire's actions right now, but yet to be seen exactly how Biden is going to react to this, and definitely the timing is going to make for a pretty intense showdown here.